The small coffee shop on Main Street buzzed with the usual morning crowd, but Sarah Chin sat in the corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. She watched the steam rise from other customers' drinks, each wisp reminding her of smoke she'd rather forget. The newspaper lay folded beside her, headlines screaming about conflicts in distant lands that felt too close to home. Sarah had been living in Millfield for 3 years now, and most people knew her as the quiet woman who worked at the local veterinary clinic. She had skilled hands that could calm even the most frightened animals, and a gentleness that made pet owners trust her completely. What they didn't know was that those same hands had once held very different tools in very different circumstances. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Sarah's trained eyes automatically scanned the newcomer without lifting her head. Tall, broad shoulders, purposeful stride, eyes that swept the room in a practiced way before settling on the counter. Military bearing was hard to hide, even in civilian clothes. Sarah recognized it because she carried it too, though she'd learned to soften hers over the years. Marcus Rivera ordered his coffee black and chose a table near the window. He just moved to Millfield after his medical discharge from the Navy SEALs, and everything still felt foreign. The small-town pace was so different from the intensity he was used to. His physical therapist had recommended this place, saying the owner made the best coffee for miles around, and that it was a good spot to ease back into civilian life. As Marcus settled into his seat, he noticed the woman in the corner. Something about her stillness caught his attention. In his experience as a SEAL medic, he learned to read body language, and her spoke of someone fighting an internal battle. She held herself with a control that suggested military training, but there was a vulnerability in the way she kept checking the exits that he recognized all too well. Sarah felt his gaze and looked up briefly. Their eyes met for just a moment, but it was enough. She saw the recognition there, the same haunted look she'd seen in her own mirror for years. Quickly, she gathered her things and headed for the door, leaving money on the table without finishing her coffee. Marcus watched her leave, noting the slight favor she gave her left leg and the way she moved through the crowd with tactical awareness. He'd seen enough wounded warriors to recognize one, even years after the fact. Especially then, over the next few weeks, their paths crossed repeatedly in the small town. Sarah would be coming out of the grocery store as Marcus was going in. She'd be walking her neighbor's dog when he passed on his morning run. Each time, she would acknowledge him with a polite nod, but never lingered for conversation. Marcus found himself curious about the quiet woman who seemed to appear everywhere he went. At the hardware store, he overheard the clerk mentioning that Dr. Chun from the vet clinic was picking up supplies for a new shelter they were building. The way the man spoke about her suggested deep respect for her work with animals. "She's got a gift," the clerk said to his co-worker. "Can calm any creature, no matter how scared or hurt it is. Been working miracles over at that clinic since she moved here." That evening, Marcus decided to volunteer at the animal shelter. He told himself it was because he needed something to do with his hands, a way to feel useful again. The truth was more complicated, but he wasn't ready to examine it too closely. Sarah was surprised when she arrived at the shelter the next morning to find Marcus already there, sleeves rolled up, helping to repair damaged kennel doors. The shelter director, Mrs. Patterson, was practically glowing with gratitude. "He showed up this morning and just started working," she told Sarah in hushed, excited tones. "Says he has experience with construction and wants to help. Look at what he's already accomplished." Sarah watched Marcus work from across the room. His movements were precise and economical, the work of someone accustomed to operating under pressure. When a frightened pit bull mix started barking aggressively at his presence, Sarah saw him freeze, take a breath, and then continue working with deliberate calm until the dog settled. "He's good with them," Mrs. Patterson continued. "The animals, I mean. Most strangers make them nervous, but he seems to understand how to move around them." Sarah nodded, still watching. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself just slightly apart from everyone else. The invisible wall that trauma builds around a person was familiar to her. She'd built her own. As the morning progressed, they worked in the same space, but maintained careful distance. Sarah was cleaning kennels while Marcus repaired fencing in the outdoor run area. The shelter had recently taken in several dogs from a hoarding situation, and they were all severely traumatized. Most of the volunteers couldn't get near them, but Sarah had a way of moving that didn't trigger their fear responses. Marcus found himself watching her technique. She never approached directly, never made sudden movements, never forced interaction. Instead, she would work nearby, talking softly about nothing in particular, letting the animals decide when they felt safe enough to investigate. It was masterful, and it reminded him of techniques he'd used in field medicine when treating civilians in combat zones. One of the dogs, a German Shepherd mix with distinctive scarring on his face, had been completely unapproachable since arriving. The vet suspected he'd been used for fighting before ending up in the hoarding situation. Sarah had been working with him for days, making slow progress. Marcus was replacing a section of fence nearby when the dog suddenly bolted from his kennel, which someone had accidentally left unsecured. The animal ran straight toward the fence line where Marcus was working, panic in his eyes, and his body language screaming fight or flight. Without thinking, Marcus dropped his tools and went completely still. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Easy, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Sarah appeared at his shoulder, moving so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. She didn't speak, but her presence seemed to calm both Marcus and the dog. Together, they formed a loose circle around the frightened animal, not trapping him, but giving him space while blocking his escape routes. "He's been hurt," Sarah said quietly, her first words directly to Marcus. "Badly. Look at the way he holds his left rear leg." Marcus saw it immediately. The dog was favoring the leg, and now that he looked closer, he could see the telltale signs of an old injury that had healed incorrectly. Probably broke it and never got proper treatment. They worked together in silent coordination, Sarah using her voice to keep the dog calm, while Marcus slowly retrieved a leash from the nearby supply shed. It took 20 minutes, but eventually they had the dog secured and back in his kennel, this time with a properly latched door. "Thank you," Sarah said as they washed their hand at the outdoor spigot. "Most people would have tried to grab him or called for help. You knew to stay calm." Marcus dried his hands on his jeans, choosing his words carefully. "Scared creatures react to the energy you put out. If you're panicked, they panic too." Sarah studied his face, seeing the knowledge there that came from experience, not textbook learning. "You've worked with trauma before." It wasn't really a question, and Marcus didn't answer it directly. "That dog needs surgery on his leg. The way it healed, it's probably causing him constant pain. That's why he's so defensive." "I know," Sarah replied. "I've been trying to convince the director to approve the expense, but the shelter budget is already stretched thin." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that they were talking about more than just the dog's leg. Physical wounds were often easier to treat than the ones that couldn't be seen. Over the following weeks, Marcus became a regular presence at the shelter. He had a knack for the repair work that the place desperately needed, and his calm demeanor seemed to have a positive effect on both the animals and the other volunteers. Sarah found herself looking forward to the days he would be there, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Their conversations remained brief and focused on the work at hand, but Marcus began to notice small details about Sarah that intrigued him. The way she unconsciously scanned rooms when she entered them. How she always kept her back to walls when possible. The slight tremor in her hands, sometimes when helicopters flew overhead. The careful way she avoided talking about her past. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself studying Marcus when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed how he moved with the fluid efficiency of someone with combat training. The way he instinctively positioned himself between potential threats and the people he was talking to. How he startled sometimes at sudden noises, but recovered so quickly most people didn't notice. One afternoon, while they were both working to socialize a litter of puppies that had been found abandoned, Sarah watched Marcus's gentle patience with a particularly fearful pup and felt something shift inside her chest. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to feel drawn to anyone. "You're good at this," she said, gesturing to the puppy that was now sleeping peacefully in Marcus's lap. Marcus looked down at the small creature and smiled slightly. "I used to have a dog. Before." He caught himself before saying more, but Sarah heard the weight in those two words. "What happened to him?" she asked gently. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, stroking the puppy's fur with careful fingers. "He was with me overseas. Working dog. Bomb detection. Got caught in an IED blast that was meant for our convoy." His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. "I tried to save him, but—" "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. She understood the special bond between working partners, human or otherwise. "What was his name?" "Rex." Marcus smiled slightly at the memory. "He was the best partner I ever had. Saved more lives than I can count." Sarah felt her own carefully maintained walls crack slightly. She recognized the guilt in Marcus's voice, the weight of surviving when others didn't. It was a burden she knew intimately. "He sounds like he was lucky to have you as a partner," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her then, really looked, and Sarah felt exposed under his gaze. She saw the moment when he recognized something in her expression, the same haunted knowledge that lived in his own eyes. "You know," he said softly, "about losing partners." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't spoken about Afghanistan to anyone since her discharge. The sessions with military counselors had been mandatory and impersonal, focused on checking boxes rather than healing wounds. But something about Marcus's quiet understanding made her want to trust him with the truth. Instead, she stood abruptly, the puppies in her lap tumbling gently to the blanket. "I should check on the other animals," she said, and walked away before he could respond. Marcus watched her go, recognizing the retreat for what it was. He'd pushed too hard, too fast. In his work as a medic, he'd learned that healing couldn't be rushed, especially when the wounds went deeper than flesh and bone. That evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment above the veterinary clinic, she found herself thinking about Marcus's question. The walls she'd built around her memories felt less solid than they had in years. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, without judgment or pity. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of carrying the weight alone. She pulled out her laptop and stared at the blank document on her screen. For 3 years, she'd been telling people she'd been a medic in the Army, which was true as far as it went. What she didn't tell them was where she'd served, or what she'd seen, or why she'd left the service with a medical discharge that had nothing to do with visible wounds. Sarah typed one word, Afghanistan. Then she deleted it and closed the laptop. Some stories, she told herself, were better left untold. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the small town around her, Sarah found herself wondering what it might feel like to share the burden with someone who would understand. For the first time in 3 years, the silence felt more like a choice than a necessity. Marcus, in his own apartment across town, was having similar thoughts. He'd come to Millfield to heal in solitude, convinced that civilian life meant leaving the warrior part of himself behind. But meeting Sarah had awakened something he thought he'd lost, a sense of connection and purpose that went beyond individual survival. He thought about the careful way she moved through the world, always alert, but trying to appear relaxed. The skill with which she handled traumatized animals suggested experience with trauma that went far beyond veterinary school. And the recognition in her eyes when she looked at him told him that whatever she'd experienced, it had left marks similar to his own. Marcus had learned in his SEAL training that the strongest teams were built on trust and communication. But he'd also learned that trust had to be earned slowly, especially with people who had been broken by their service to others. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus found himself planning how to show Sarah that he could be trusted with whatever secrets she carried. Not because he needed to know, but because he suspected she needed someone to understand. The next morning dawned gray and misty, matching Sarah's mood as she made her way to the shelter. She'd slept poorly, her dreams filled with the sounds and images she'd worked so hard to suppress. The smell of diesel fuel and dust, the weight of combat gear, the faces of people she'd tried and failed to save. She arrived at the shelter early, hoping to lose herself in routine work before the other volunteers arrived. But Marcus was already there, sitting quietly in the outdoor run with the German Shepherd mix they'd helped the week before. Sarah watched from the doorway as Marcus slowly extended his hand, letting the dog sniff his fingers. The animal, who had been virtually unapproachable since his arrival, actually stepped closer instead of backing away. "I brought him some breakfast," Marcus said without looking up, somehow aware of her presence. "Thought maybe if he associated me with good things, he might start to trust people again." Sarah stepped into the run, moving slowly so as not to startle the dog. "What did you bring?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Scrambled eggs and a little bacon. My grandmother always said there wasn't much that couldn't be healed with good food and patience." The dog, emboldened by the smell of bacon, actually approached Marcus's outstretched hand. For just a moment, the animal's guard dropped, and Sarah could see the gentle creature he must have been before the world taught him to fear. "Your grandmother sounds wise," Sarah said, settling down a few feet away. "She raised me after my parents died," Marcus replied, still focused on the dog. "She used to say that healing wasn't about forgetting the hurt, but about learning to carry it without letting it carry you." Sarah felt those words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been letting her past carry her for 3 years, making decisions based on fear rather than hope. The realization was uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," she said quietly. Marcus finally looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Not pity or curiosity, but understanding and acceptance. It was an expression that said he would wait as long as she needed, without pressure or judgment. "Sarah," he said gently, "I want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Not if you don't want to." The words hung in the air between them, an offer and a promise rolled into one. Sarah felt tears threaten for the first time in years, not from sadness but from the relief of being seen and accepted. She didn't answer immediately, but she didn't run away either. Instead, she stayed in the quiet morning light, watching Marcus work his patient magic on a broken animal, and wondered if maybe it was time to let someone work a little magic on her broken places too. The German Shepherd, perhaps sensing the emotional shift in his human companions, took a tentative step closer to Sarah and rested his head against her knee. It was the first time he'd voluntarily made contact with anyone since arriving at the shelter. "Well," Sarah said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears, "I guess we're all learning to trust again." Marcus smiled, and for the first time since coming to Millfield, Sarah felt like she might actually be home. 3 weeks after their quiet moment in the shelter run, Sarah found herself looking forward to Marcus's presence in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. Their interactions had remained professional and carefully bounded, but there was an undercurrent of understanding that made even mundane tasks feel significant. The German Shepherd, whom they'd named Atlas after his strength in overcoming his fears, had become a bridge between them. His progress served as a daily reminder that healing was possible, even after severe trauma. Under their combined care, he'd begun to trust again, though he remained wary of strangers. Sarah was reviewing Atlas's medical charts when Dr. Morrison, the head veterinarian, knocked on her office door. His expression was serious, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "We got the results back from Atlas's x-rays," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "The leg is worse than we thought. The bone healed incorrectly in multiple places, and there's evidence of old fractures that were never properly set." Sarah studied the x-ray images, her trained eye seeing what Dr. Morrison meant. The dog's leg was a roadmap of old injuries, each one telling a story of pain and survival. "Surgery?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Complex orthopedic surgery. Multiple procedures, probably. The recovery would be long and intensive." Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair. "The shelter board is meeting tonight to discuss it. The cost would be significant, and there's no guarantee he'd ever be completely sound. Sarah nodded, understanding the difficult position everyone was in. Shelters had to make impossible choices every day, weighing the needs of one animal against the resources that could help many others. "What are his chances without surgery?" she asked, though she didn't really want to hear the answer. "He'll live, but he'll always be in pain. And the joint damage will only get worse over time." Dr. Morrison's expression was kind, but realistic. "At some point, the pain will become unbearable." After Dr. Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at Atlas's x-rays. The dog had survived so much already, had just begun to trust and hope again. The idea of giving up on him felt like betraying everything she'd learned about resilience and second chances. She was still lost in thought when Marcus appeared in her doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Mrs. Patterson said you looked like you needed caffeine," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Bad news." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured to the x-rays on her desk. "Atlas needs surgery. Expensive, complex surgery that the shelter probably can't afford." Marcus studied the images with the trained eye of someone who'd seen plenty of battlefield injuries. "That's a lot of old damage. How do they determine his age?" "Best guess is 3 or 4 years old, which means he was probably injured as a puppy and never got proper treatment." Sarah's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "He's been living with this pain his entire adult life." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him processing the information. She'd learned to read his expressions over the past few weeks, and she recognized the look of someone working through a problem. "What if the surgery was donated?" he asked finally. "What do you mean? What if someone covered the cost privately? Would the shelter approve the surgery then?" Sarah looked at him carefully. "Marcus, orthopedic surgery like this could cost thousands of dollars. The recovery alone would require weeks of intensive care." "That's not what I asked," he said gently. "I asked if the shelter would approve it, if cost wasn't a factor." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, a combination of hope and worry. "You can't afford something like this. No one expects you to dash. My disability settlement from the Navy was substantial," Marcus interrupted quietly. "And I don't have anyone to spend money on except myself. Atlas deserves a chance at a pain-free life." Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed by his generosity and what it meant. "Why would you do this? You barely know him." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the x-rays on her desk. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "Because I know what it's like to carry pain that no one else can see. And I know what it means when someone refuses to give up on you, even when giving up would be easier." He looked directly at her then. "Atlas isn't the only one who deserves a second chance." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond the dog situation. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls tremble, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. "I'll call Dr. Morrison," she finally managed. "If you're sure about this." "I'm sure." The surgery was scheduled for the following week at a specialized veterinary hospital 2 hours away. Marcus insisted on driving, and Sarah found herself sitting in his pickup truck, watching the familiar countryside roll past as they made their way toward what felt like a turning point. They dropped Atlas off the night before, and the separation had been harder than Sarah had expected. The dog had looked at her with such trust as she'd handed him over to the surgical team, and she'd promised him they'd be there when he woke up. "Nervous?" Marcus asked as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. It was more honesty than she'd intended, but something about Marcus's presence made her want to tell the truth. The waiting room was quiet and sterile, filled with the antiseptic smell that brought back memories Sarah would rather forget. She sat rigidly in her chair, hands clenched in her lap, trying to focus on the present moment instead of the images her mind wanted to show her. Marcus noticed her tension and moved his chair slightly closer, not touching but offering his presence as an anchor. "Tell me about the worst case you ever handled at the clinic," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him in confusion. "What?" because talking about work helps pass time, and because I can see you're somewhere else right now. Somewhere that's not helping. Sarah understood then. He was trying to keep her grounded in the present, to give her mind something concrete to focus on, instead of letting it drift into darker territory. There was a dog that came in last year, she began slowly. Hit by a car, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. The family couldn't afford the surgery, and they were talking about putting him down. What happened? I stayed with him through the night. Did what I could with basic supplies. By morning, he was stable enough that Dr. Morrison agreed to do the surgery at cost. Sarah smiled slightly at the memory. He made a full recovery. The family sends us Christmas cards now. You saved him, Marcus said simply. We all did. It was a team effort. But you were the one who stayed through the night when no one else would. Sarah felt something shift inside her at his words. She'd always focused on what she couldn't save, the lives that had slipped through her fingers despite her best efforts. Hearing Marcus acknowledge what she had saved felt foreign, but comforting. They spent the next 4 hours talking about their work, their favorite cases, the satisfaction of helping creatures that couldn't help themselves. Sarah found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone, memories from the clinic, but also from before when her medical skills had been used in very different circumstances. I was a combat medic, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. In Afghanistan. 2 tours. Marcus went very still beside her. How long were you over there? 18 months total, with the 82nd Airborne. Sarah's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. I worked forward aid stations, mostly trauma surgery, in conditions that would make most civilian doctors quit. That's where you learn to work under pressure, Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a question. That's where I learned a lot of things. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then continued. I was good at it. Really good. I could stop bleeding, stabilize fractures, keep people alive long enough to get them to proper medical facilities. But Marcus prompted gently, sensing there was more. Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. But I couldn't save everyone. And the ones I lost. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus understood. In his own experience as a SEAL medic, he'd learned that the successful saves never weighed as much as the failures. No matter how many lives you preserved, it was the ones that slipped away that haunted your dreams. How many? He asked quietly. 17. The number came out like a confession. 17 soldiers who died in my hands, despite everything I knew, everything I tried. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. He'd carried his own count for so long, had thought he was alone in that particular kind of accounting. 12, he said simply. Sarah looked at him, then really looked, and saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. You count them too. Everyone. Marcus's voice was rough with emotion. Their names, their ages, the circumstances. I remember all of it. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 warriors who had carried their casualties alone for too long. The waiting room around them faded away, and for a few precious minutes, neither of them felt quite so isolated in their grief. The worst part, Sarah said quietly, is that everyone thanks you for your service, but they don't want to hear about the cost. They want heroes, not broken people trying to figure out how to live with what they've seen. Marcus nodded. The civilian world doesn't know what to do with us. We're supposed to transition seamlessly back to normal life, but normal doesn't exist anymore. Is that why you came to Millfield? Sarah asked. To try to find normal? I came here to disappear, Marcus admitted. To find somewhere quiet where I could stop pretending to be okay. He looked at her. What about you? Same, I think. I got tired trying to explain why helicopters make me flinch, why I can't sleep without checking all the locks twice, why crowds make me nervous. Sarah smiled sadly. It's easier to just be the quiet vet tech who keeps to herself. A nurse appeared in the doorway before Marcus could respond. Mr. Rivera? Dr. Patterson would like to speak with you about Atlas. They followed the nurse down a sterile hallway that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of field hospitals. The surgeon, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and steady hands, met them in a small consultation room. The surgery went well, she said without preamble. Better than I expected, actually. The bone was damaged, but it was clean damage. We were able to repair most of it with plates and screws. Sarah felt relief flood through her. His prognosis? Good. Very good, with proper physical therapy. He'll never be a working dog again, but he should be pain-free and mobile. Dr. Patterson smiled. He's a fighter. Woke up from anesthesia ahead of schedule and was trying to stand before we had him fully stabilized. They were allowed to see Atlas briefly before the drive home. The dog was groggy but alert, his tail making weak attempts to wag when he saw them. Sarah knelt beside his recovery crate and spoke to him softly, promises about walks without pain and runs in the sunshine. Marcus watched her with Atlas and felt something settle into place in his chest. This woman, who had seen so much pain and carried so much guilt, still had enough compassion to fight for broken things, including perhaps him. On the drive back to Millfield, they were both quiet, processing the day's revelations. Sarah stared out the window at the passing landscape, thinking about the conversation in the waiting room. For the first time in 3 years, she'd spoken about Afghanistan to someone who understood, and the world hadn't ended. "Thank you," she said as they pulled into town. "For Atlas, but also for listening. I haven't talked about any of that in a long time." Marcus pulled into the parking lot behind the veterinary clinic and turned off the engine. "Thank you for trusting me with it." They sat in the gathering dusk, neither making a move to get out of the truck. Sarah felt balanced on the edge of something important, a decision that would change the careful isolation she'd built around herself. "Marcus," she said quietly, "would you like to have dinner sometime? Not at the diner or anywhere public, just at my place. I make a decent stir-fry." Marcus looked at her with something that might have been relief. "I like that very much. Tomorrow night? 7 o'clock. It's a date," Marcus said, then paused. "Is it okay that I called it a date?" Sarah felt herself smile for what felt like the first time in months. "It's okay. It's more than okay." As Sarah climbed the stairs to her apartment that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. The walls she'd built around her heart were still there, but they had cracks in them now, places where light could get through. She thought about Atlas, recovering from surgery that would give him a new lease on life, and about Marcus, who had refused to let either of them face their battles alone. Maybe her grandmother had been wrong about some wounds being too deep to heal. Maybe with the right person and enough patience, even the most broken things could learn to be whole again. That night, Sarah slept better than she had in years, and for the first time in a long time, her dreams were filled with hope instead of smoke. Sarah stood in her small kitchen the next evening, staring at the ingredients spread across her counter as if they held the secrets of the universe. She'd cooked for herself countless times over the past 3 years, but somehow preparing dinner for Marcus felt monumentally different. Every choice seemed weighted with meaning she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. The apartment she'd rented above the veterinary clinic was modest but comfortable, decorated in soft blues and whites that reminded her of peaceful skies rather than the harsh desert landscapes that haunted her memories. She'd chosen everything deliberately, creating a space that felt like a sanctuary from the chaos in her mind. Marcus arrived exactly at 7, holding a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers that looked like he'd picked them from someone's garden rather than bought them from a store. The gesture was somehow more meaningful for its simplicity. "I hope you don't mind dandelions," he said with a slight smile. "I saw them growing wild behind my apartment building, and they reminded me of you." Sarah took the flowers, genuinely touched. "Most people think of dandelions as weeds. Most people don't see their strength," Marcus replied. "They can grow anywhere, survive almost anything, and they're beautiful even when everyone thinks they're just taking up space." The words hit Sarah unexpectedly deep, and she had to look away to compose herself. "I'll put these in water. Make yourself at home." As Sarah arranged the flowers in a mason jar, she watched Marcus explore her living space from the corner of her eye. He moved carefully, respectfully, taking in the few personal items she'd allowed herself to display. A photo of her parents, some books on animal behavior, and trauma recovery. A small collection of smooth stones she'd found during her early morning walks. "You have good taste," he said, studying a painting of mountain meadows that hung above her couch. "It's peaceful here." "That was the idea," Sarah admitted, returning from the kitchen. "I needed somewhere that felt safe." They settled into an easy rhythm as Sarah finished preparing dinner. Marcus asked if he could help, and she put him to work chopping vegetables while she handled the stir-fry. Working together in the small kitchen required a natural coordination that surprised them both, their movements synchronized without conscious effort. "You're good at this," Sarah observed, watching him dice onions with professional precision. "Knife work was part of my training," Marcus said, then paused. "Different kind of cutting, obviously." Sarah understood. Military training left its mark in unexpected ways, turning mundane civilian tasks into reminders of harder times. She found herself applying tactical medical knowledge to veterinary work, using trauma surgery techniques to save injured animals. As they sat down to eat, Sarah felt nervous energy coursing through her. This was uncharted territory, allowing someone into her personal space, sharing a meal that wasn't hurried or public. Marcus seemed to sense her anxiety and kept the conversation light, talking about Atlas's recovery prospects and his plans for the shelter's new outdoor run. "Dr. Patterson called this afternoon," Sarah said, serving the stir-fry. "Atlas is ahead of schedule in his recovery. She thinks he might be ready to come back to Millfield sooner than expected." "That's good news. How are you feeling about it?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Hopeful and terrified. He's been through so much trauma, and now he's vulnerable again while he heals. It feels like a metaphor for everything else." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Recovery is scary because it requires vulnerability. When you're healing, you can't keep all your defenses up. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself studying Marcus's face in the soft lamplight, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow and the way his eyes crinkled when he was thinking. There was something solid about his presence that made her feel grounded in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said eventually. "Of course. What made you decide to become a veterinarian? I mean, after your military service." Sarah set down her fork and considered her answer. It was a question she'd been asked many times over the past 3 years, and she developed a safe, standard response. But sitting here with Marcus, after everything they'd shared, she wanted to tell him the truth. "Animals don't judge," she said quietly. "They don't care about your past, or your mistakes, or the things that wake you up at night. They just respond to how you treat them in the moment." Marcus waited, sensing there was more. "After I was discharged, I couldn't handle being around people for a while. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, wanted to hear war stories or thank me for my service, but they couldn't handle the real truth of what service actually cost." Sarah's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the old pain in her eyes. "Animals were different. I could help them without having to explain myself or pretend to be okay when I wasn't." "What happened?" Marcus asked gently. "Your discharge, I mean. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with memories she'd kept locked away for 3 years. Something about Marcus's patient presence made her want to trust him with the whole story, not just the sanitized version she'd been telling herself. "There was an attack on our forward aid station," she began slowly. "Coordinated assault, rockets, and small arms fire. We were treating casualties from a convoy that had hit an IED when they hit us." Marcus felt his blood chill. He'd been in similar situations, knew the chaos and terror of being trapped in a medical facility under fire. "I had 3 critical patients on the table when the first rocket hit," Sarah continued. 2 soldiers and a local child who'd been caught in the convoy blast. Protocol said to evacuate the medical staff to the bunkers and wait for security to clear the area. "But you stayed," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded. "I couldn't leave them. One of the soldiers was bleeding out from a severed artery. The child had internal injuries that needed immediate surgery, and the third soldier had traumatic brain injury that required constant monitoring. Her voice cracked slightly. I made the choice to stay and continue working while the attack continued around us. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. The attack lasted 4 hours, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 hours of operating while mortars fell around us, trying to save lives while expecting to die any moment. I managed to stabilize all 3 patients, got them ready for evacuation when the helicopters could finally get in. That sounds like heroic action to me, Marcus said quietly. Sarah shook her head. During the attack, while I was working on the child, a piece of shrapnel came through the tent wall. It missed me by inches, but it hit one of the other medics who had stayed to help. Her eyes filled with tears. He died instantly. Died because he was standing where I should have been standing. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. That's not your fault, isn't it? Sarah's voice was raw with pain. I made the decision to stay. I asked him to help me. If I had followed protocol and evacuated when ordered, he'd still be alive. Marcus understood now. The guilt that had been eating at Sarah for 3 years wasn't just about the patients she couldn't save. It was about the colleague who died because of her choices. What was his name? Marcus asked. Corporal James Mitchell. Jamie. He was 22 years old, engaged to his high school sweetheart. He used to show me pictures of his fiancée and talk about their wedding plans. Sarah's tears came freely now. He died because I decided that saving those 3 patients was worth the risk. Did you save them? Marcus asked quietly. All 3. The soldiers made full recoveries. The child was reunited with her family. Sarah wiped her eyes with her free hand. But Jamie never made a home. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing Sarah's story. As a SEAL medic, he'd faced similar impossible choices, situations where there were no good options, and someone always paid the price. Sarah, he said finally, you saved 3 lives that day. 3 people went home to their families because you made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. At the cost of Jamie's life. Jamie made his own choice to stay and help. He was a combat medic too, right? He understood the risks and chose to save lives alongside you. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. You can't take responsibility for his choice any more than he would want you to diminish the lives you saved. Sarah looked at him through her tears, wanting to believe his words, but unable to let go of the guilt she'd carried for so long. The military gave me a commendation for my actions that day, she said bitterly. Silver Star for gallantry in action. They called it heroic devotion to duty. But I know the truth. I know that my choices got a good man killed. Marcus stood up and moved around the table, pulling Sarah into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, sobbing with a grief she'd never allowed herself to fully feel. You survived something that would have broken most people, Marcus said quietly, stroking her hair. And instead of letting it destroy you, you've spent the last 3 years saving lives in a different way. Jamie would be proud of who you've become. They stood like that for a long time, Sarah crying against Marcus's shoulder while he held her steady. She couldn't remember the last time she'd let anyone comfort her, and the relief of finally sharing her burden was overwhelming. I've never told anyone the whole story before, Sarah said when her tears finally subsided. Thank you for trusting me with it, Marcus replied. It couldn't have been easy. Sarah pulled back slightly to look at his face. What about you? What brought you home? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him weighing whether to trust her with his own secrets. My last mission, he said finally. We were extracting a high-value target from a compound in Syria. Intelligence was wrong about the location of hostiles. We walked into an ambush. Sarah waited, recognizing the same careful tone she'd used when beginning her own story. I lost 3 team members that night, Marcus continued. My best friend since SEAL training, a kid who just gotten married, and our team leader who had more combat experience than the rest of us combined. You were the medic, Sarah said quietly. Marcus nodded. I tried everything. Field surgery, emergency transfusions, CPR. I worked on them for hours while we waited for extraction. But the injuries were too severe. I watched all three of them die despite everything I knew, everything I trained for. Sarah understood the weight in his voice, the guilt of surviving when others didn't. The worst part was coming home and having to face their families, Marcus said, looking their wives and parents in the eye and trying to explain why I made it out when they didn't. Survivor's guilt, Sarah said softly. That's what the Navy psychologist called it. But it felt like more than that. It felt like I'd failed at the one thing I was supposed to be best at, keeping my team alive. Sarah took his hands in hers, understanding now why he'd been so generous with Atlas, why he'd recognized her pain so clearly. We're quite a pair, she said with a watery smile. Two broken medics trying to figure out how to live with the weight of who we couldn't save. Marcus smiled slightly. Maybe that's why we found each other. Maybe we needed someone who understood that particular kind of pain. They cleaned up dinner together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the same natural coordination as before. But now there was a deeper understanding between them, a recognition of shared burdens that made the silence comfortable rather than awkward. As Marcus prepared to leave, Sarah felt a moment of panic. The evening had been intense and emotional, and she wasn't sure what happened next. Did they pretend the conversation had never happened? Did they acknowledge this new level of intimacy between them? Sarah, Marcus said as if reading her thoughts, I want you to know that nothing changes because of tonight. I mean, everything changes, but nothing has to be different unless you want it to be. Sarah looked at him, this man who had listened to her darkest secret without judgment and shared his own in return. I want things to be different, she said quietly. I want to try trusting someone again. I want to try healing. Marcus stepped closer and gently cupped her face in his hands. Are you sure? Instead of answering with words, Sarah rose up on her tiptoes and kissed him softly. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and tentative hope, of two wounded people choosing to be vulnerable together. When they broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, he said quietly. I know, Sarah replied, but I want to try. For the first time in 3 years, I want to try. After Marcus left, Sarah sat on her couch with the mason jar dandelions, thinking about courage and resilience and the unexpected ways that healing could begin. For so long, she believed that her past made her unworthy of love or companionship. But Marcus saw her clearly, all of her, including the broken parts, and chose to stay anyway. Atlas will be coming home soon, ready to begin his new life, free from the pain that had defined his existence. Perhaps, Sarah thought, it was time for her to do the same. Outside her window, the small town of Millfield settled into peaceful sleep, and for the first time since leaving the service, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere. She might actually belong with someone. The dandelions on her coffee table seemed to glow in the lamplight, beautiful and strong and perfectly imperfect, just like the life she was finally ready to build. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same shelter run where she and Marcus had first worked together, watching Atlas play with a group of children from the local elementary school. The dog moved with only the slightest limp, his surgical scars hidden beneath thick, healthy fur. More importantly, his eyes held joy instead of fear, and his tail wagged freely as the children laughed and played around him. He's come so far, Mrs. Patterson said, joining Sarah at the fence. I honestly didn't think he'd ever trust people again when he first arrived. Sarah smiled, remembering the terrified, aggressive animal who had arrived at the shelter nearly a year ago. Sometimes healing takes longer than we expect, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. The words applied to more than just Atlas. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had slowly begun to reconstruct her life with Marcus as her partner in the process. It hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been setbacks, moments of panic when the past threatened to overwhelm the present, nights when old nightmares returned with a vengeance. But there had also been breakthrough moments. The first time she'd slept peacefully through the night with Marcus beside her. The day she'd realized she'd gone an entire week without checking all the locks twice before bed. The morning she'd woken up and felt genuinely happy instead of just grateful to have survived another day. Marcus appeared at her side, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. Their morning routine had evolved to include coffee together before starting work, a small ritual that grounded them both in the present moment. "The adoption paperwork is almost complete," he said, handing her a cup. "The Stevens family should be able to take Atlas home by the end of the week." Sarah felt a familiar pang at the thought of Atlas leaving the shelter. She'd become deeply attached to the dog during his recovery, but she knew that attachment came from her own need to protect rather than what was best for him. "They're good people," she said, watching the children play with Atlas. "He'll be happy with them. And we'll still see him for regular checkups," Marcus added. "Dr. Morrison will want to monitor his surgical sites for at least another year." Sarah nodded, appreciating his understanding that letting go was still difficult for her. Marcus had learned to read her moods and fears with the same precision he'd once applied to battlefield medicine. He knew when to offer comfort and when to give her space to process her emotions independently. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on a foundation of mutual understanding and shared experience. They'd both been too damaged for grand romantic gestures or passionate declarations. Instead, their love had grown quietly, day by day, in shared silences and small acts of care. They'd established their own rhythm of healing together. Marcus had started attending therapy sessions at the VA hospital 2 hours away, making the drive twice a week to work through his survivor's guilt with a counselor who specialized in combat trauma. Sarah had begun seeing a private therapist in town, someone who understood both military and civilian PTSD. The work was hard and often painful, but doing it alongside someone who understood made it bearable. They could share their setbacks without judgment and celebrate their progress without having to explain why small victories felt monumental. "I got a call this morning," Marcus said as they watched Atlas interact with the children. "From my old unit commander." Sarah looked at him carefully. Contact from his military past was still difficult for Marcus, often triggering days of difficult memories and guilt. "What did he want?" she asked. "He's recommending me for a position with a nonprofit that works with veteran mental health. They need someone with medical training who understands combat trauma." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. It would mean traveling sometimes, speaking at conferences, training other healthcare providers. Sarah felt her chest tighten with automatic anxiety. The idea of Marcus leaving, even temporarily, triggered all her abandonment fears. But she'd learned to pause and examine her reactions before responding, to separate past trauma from present reality. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, genuinely wanting to know his thoughts rather than imposing her fears on his decision. Marcus looked at her with the careful attention he always gave her when discussing difficult topics. Terrified and honored at the same time. The work would be meaningful, a way to use my experience to help other people who are struggling. But it would also mean regularly talking about things I'd rather forget. Sarah understood the conflict. She'd been feeling similar tensions lately as her own healing progressed. The deeper she went into recovery, the more she felt called to use her experience to help others. But that meant confronting her past on a regular basis rather than simply managing it. "Would you consider it if the travel wasn't an issue?" she asked. "I think so, but I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize what we've built together." Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. "Our relationship is more important to me than any career opportunity." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. 6 months ago, the idea of being someone's priority would have terrified her. Now it felt like a gift she was finally ready to accept. "What if we approached it differently?" she said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "What if we found a way for you to do the work without it requiring you to travel alone?" Marcus looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" What if we developed a program together? You have the SEAL medical background, I have the Army combat medic experience. We both understand the transition to civilian life and the challenges of treating trauma while carrying it yourself." The idea gained momentum as Sarah spoke. "We could create training programs for civilian healthcare providers, teach them how to recognize and treat combat trauma. We could work with veterinary clinics that want to develop programs for veterans, since animals are often easier for people with PTSD to connect with initially. Marcus stared at her, and Sarah could see him processing the possibilities. We could base it here in Millfield, she continued. Use the shelter as a training ground, show people how animal-assisted therapy can be integrated into traditional treatment approaches. Atlas could be our poster child for recovery and second chances. You want to do that? Marcus asked carefully. Talk publicly about your experiences? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. A year ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. But watching Atlas overcome his trauma, seeing how her work with animals had helped her own healing, she felt ready to share that knowledge with others. I think I would, she said slowly. I think I need to. All of our pain, all of our experience, it shouldn't just be something we survive. Maybe it can be something that helps other people survive too. Marcus reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. We could call it the Second Chances program. Sarah smiled at the name. I like that. Second chances for veterans, second chances for animals, second chances for people who think they're too broken to heal. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Atlas play and imagining the possibilities their shared future might hold. Sarah felt a sense of purpose awakening in her that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. But this time, the mission felt sustainable, something she could pursue without sacrificing her own well-being. There's something else I need to tell you, Marcus said eventually. Something I've been thinking about for a while. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety, but it was manageable now, a brief spike rather than overwhelming panic. I love you, Marcus said simply. I've loved you for months, but I wanted to make sure I was saying it for the right reasons. Not because you saved me or because we understand each other's pain, but because of who you are and who we are together. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came with relief and joy rather than grief. I love you too, she said softly. I was afraid to say it because I thought love was something I'd lost the right to have. But you've shown me that broken people can love each other in beautiful ways. Marcus leaned down and kissed her gently, and Sarah felt the last of her walls crumble. Not into destruction, but into foundation stones for something new and strong. When they broke apart, Atlas had wandered over to the fence and was watching them with what looked suspiciously like approval in his dark eyes. Even he knows we're good together, Marcus said, laughing. Sarah reached through the fence to scratch Atlas behind the ears. You were our catalyst, weren't you, boy? You brought us together and taught us how to heal. Atlas wagged his tail and pressed his nose against her hand, a gesture of trust and affection that would have been impossible when he first arrived at the shelter. That evening, Sarah and Marcus sat on the porch of her apartment, planning their future program and watching the sun set over Millfield. The small town had given them both refuge when they needed it most, and now it would serve as the home base for their mission to help others find their own path to healing. I want to call Jamie's fiancée, Sarah said suddenly. I want to tell her about the program and ask if she'd like to be involved somehow. Maybe create a scholarship in his memory for veterans pursuing healthcare training. Marcus looked at her with surprise and admiration. 6 months ago, the idea of contacting anyone from her military past would have sent Sarah into a panic attack. Now, she was ready to honor Jamie's memory in a way that could help others. That's a beautiful idea, he said. Do you think you're ready for that conversation? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think I'm ready to stop running from my past and start using it to build something better. Jamie died trying to save lives. Maybe this program can be a way of continuing that mission. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a peace she'd never expected to find again. The nightmares would probably never completely disappear, and there would always be days when the weight of memory felt unbearable. But she was no longer facing those challenges alone. Marcus had taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain had never happened. It was about learning to carry the weight in a way that allowed for growth and purpose and love. Atlas had taught her that even the most broken spirits could learn to trust again with patience and understanding. And her work with animals had taught her that healing was possible for any creature brave enough to accept help when it was offered. 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of a room full of civilian doctors, nurses, and therapists, telling her story publicly for the first time. Marcus sat in the front row, Atlas lying calmly at his feet, both of them offering silent support as she shared the lessons they'd learned about trauma and recovery. "We used to think that being wounded in service meant you were permanently broken," Sarah said to the attentive audience. "But we've learned that wounds can become sources of wisdom, that survival can become a foundation for service, and that love can grow in the spaces between our scars." She looked at Marcus and smiled, remembering the day they'd first worked together to save a frightened dog who had reminded them both that healing was possible. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations happen when we stop trying to heal alone and start learning to heal together. As applause filled the room, Sarah felt Jamie's presence like a blessing. She was finally using her skills and experience in a way that honored both the living and the dead, that transformed her survival into service and her pain into purpose. Outside the conference center, Atlas waited patiently in the van, wearing a vest that identified him as a therapy dog in training. He would soon begin his own mission, visiting hospitals and treatment centers to offer the same unconditional comfort that had helped Sarah and Marcus find their way back to wholeness. The three of them had learned that being wounded didn't have to mean being silent. Sometimes the most powerful stories were the ones that began with survival and ended with hope. Sometimes the greatest healing happened when you found the courage to transform your scars into sources of strength, not just for yourself, but for everyone who needed to believe that second chances were possible. As they drove home to Millfield that evening, the small town lights twinkling in the distance like stars, Sarah reached over and took Marcus's hand. Behind them, Atlas slept peacefully, his own second chance complete, and his new purpose just beginning. They were all wounded, but they were no longer silent. And in that truth, they had found not just healing, but home.